Welcome to the Jason D'Souza Show. Join us as we explore the evolving urban landscape, uncovering the trends, stories, and innovations shaping our cities. Thanks for watching and enjoy today's episode.
Stephen Cornwell, welcome to the Jason D'Souza Show.
Great to be here.
So we were just talking about how we met in dinner in Sydney, in your dinner series called Off the Record, and you were explaining about it. And I'd love you to tell that story again, because I think it was a really cool way of describing what you do and what ERA does. And I'm keen to also understand how you fell into doing what you're doing, or you probably designed. Sure. But it's great to have you. You're dialing in from New York, so I appreciate you've had a long day. And well, you're coming on, you're ending your day almost on a podcast, probably on client dinners after that, like our lives dictate. So
there are worse ways to end the day. Don't you worry. This is actually a good way to end the day.
I've got bad news. It's only Tuesday. Well, Monday for you.
Someone once said to me, people that say, thank God it's Friday, don't live in the real world.
I totally agree.
I think it's probably true.
It's true. Anyway, you were saying off the record, the dinner series.
Off the record. I mean, look, we're a placemaking company. What that means essentially is that we are in the business of real estate, but we're looking at from the human dimensions of the strategy. So how do people use space? How do people occupy buildings and places? And it's really a gap that I fell into after being on the real estate side for about 7 years here in New York City. Woods Baggett, who you've met before, you met with our CEO.
The great Sarah Kay.
Sarah Kay, wonderful.
Who's a giant in the Australian architectural world.
Absolutely huge.
And we can tell her
and in the world
now. And in the world
she's
too.
Great.
She's a global giant. Yes.
Global giant. We were talking about sort of the fact that our business is the sort of strange intersectional strategy between, say, the software of operating something and the hardware of making it. And very few people occupy that middle ground. And so the previous CEO and I, Nick Corrales, we decided we'd start a consulting business to bridge that gap, because too many buildings were being handed over that weren't operational, good for the planet point of view, but just from an operating, economically sustainable point of view. So we're sitting in that middle ground. As we've accelerated with AI, agentic tools and sort of workflows, we've seen a massive shift happen with how we're thinking about making places. And all of the focus has been on workflow and sort of how to make us more efficient. But I think we're asking the wrong questions. I think the real question, and why we call it Off the Record, is how is all of this impacting how we live?
Yeah.
How will it impact white-collar jobs, blue-collar jobs? How will it impact the cities that we live in? And I know the more I talk about it, the more people want to put their head in the sand and not really discuss it. Because
that's right.
The outcome is firstly abstract. It's not really preordained yet. No one quite knows where it's heading. And I think we're running at it way too fast, and we're not taking action with where this all might go. And so, Off the Record was a chance to put some smart people in one room, you being one of them, Jason, and really discuss what the impacts of AI are on both, not just the way we actually accelerate the knowledge imperative, which we're all agreeing that it actually makes us smarter, but we're not all agreeing with what the impact might be long term. So in the short term, the knowledge imperative works. Yes, we all get better tools, we all get smarter, all the boats are lifted, right? Everyone's floating. But what we're not really talking about is the impact of what all this means on the way we live. And there's some very simple examples of this, which is if cities in the world were created as places of work, which is what they were, it's a congregation of knowledge workers and of industry, right, to create work. If those choices are now free to live and work wherever you like, and you don't have to be in one spot to do that, what's the future of the cities and what happens to people? When I look at what's happening with rapid job losses and certainly retrenchments around the country, certainly in America, there's some very large swathes of job retrenchments happening, certainly through coders and tech, but other industries also. And I think our government is moving way too slow to understand the impact of what that might mean. In the long term, there'll be a solution, but in the short term, there's going to be people out of work, and it's going to impact a lot of things in our industry, certainly with the way we think about making places. I think we've got to move away from what is AI doing to make us all better at doing our jobs to what's the impact of AI on our lives. what will it do to actually the way we live? And I think that's the conversation we're trying to have. I don't know if you saw this, but I think I was looking up some research last week on the total impact of this, and I came across Joe Tsai, who's the chairman of Alibaba, talking about the impact AI and agentic AI would have on the world. Talking fundamentally about, I think it's $110 trillion is the sort of is the scale of the world economy, and out of that 110, I think 60%, roughly 60% or 2/3 of that labor was knowledge workers, which is a huge swathe of
which will
of
get
the industry.
disrupted by AI. Right.
Yeah. And so what bothered me about the way he ended it, though, he didn't talk about what the solution was. He said at the end of it was, so there are huge implications, and it's still sort of ill-defined as whether that's going to be positive or whether that's going to actually be disruptive. Both are true, probably.
Well, did you see that research that sort of, it was kind of an imaginative research piece that was sort of flying around on Substack, Centrini Research, saying what happened to the financial market as waves of retrenchments happened in the knowledge work. And then what that identified really was the impact on the financial system, because people started defaulting on their mortgages because they didn't have jobs.
And we might all be going back to tokens and fish hooks to trade. This is where it might all end up. Who knows where it's going?
Yeah.
The thing that's really true, though, that I think we can't ignore is that the middle class is disappearing a bit. And, the warning signs of a middle class disappearing is that there's going to be greater financial pressure on pretty much everybody. The 1% and the Mag 7 are getting richer. They're growing at 50x. I mean, there's a huge amount of wealth being made in tech, energy, and resource. Of course, that's where the money's being spent. Very little has been spent on what happens to the new ideals of how people live. And one of the things that we talked about in our off-the-record dinner, which you were very articulate in, was the year before I've been to Copenhagen with the World Fellows Group, the World Cities Fellowship, sorry. The Copenhagen trip was to sort of talk about what the future of that city is, which had just won most livable city. And they were talking about the very real concerns. They have similar challenges to everyone else: high immigration, high affordability challenges, construction affordability challenges, and of course they have a G+6 height limit across the city, which means they have to infrastructure sprawl out. Now, when the whole
I didn't know that they had that.
When the whole
city,
they have that? Because they have a cultural heritage. They have a cultural heritage that they're trying to hang on to, and it's beautiful the way it's set up. I had a podcast with the city architect talking about this, saying that we've got this challenge with the city, which is how do you retain its charm, its culture, its cyclability, which is really part of its culture, and continue to grow. And you have to get dense, and you probably have to go up at some point, right? And so this is where most cities are challenged. Vertical growth is difficult for those historic cities in particular.
I'm from Hong Kong, right? We don't really respect our heritage very much in Hong Kong. We just build everything everywhere all the time.
Which is why
it's what makes our city great, right?
That's right.
But it does, but it has made heritage. It's funny, the youth of Hong Kong, I was there just a few months ago, have really embraced Hong Kong Chinese heritage, mostly because I think they're trying to find identity in an increasingly mainland world where mainland Chinese influence is sort of everywhere in the world, and they're sort of influencing Hong Kong, and they want to remain Hong Kongers. And so what they're grabbing onto is pieces of heritage in what you would describe as regional Hong Kong or rural Hong Kong, if you can have that. So they're embracing, hiking, they're embracing fishing villages, they're embracing all that stuff, right? Hobbies, food. There's you see on Instagram all these young Hong Kongers going to sort of, cha cha teng, Hong Kong cafe type things, right? So that cultural heritage thing is very, very interesting. And I look at it in terms of Australia. We still consider ourselves a young country in many ways, right?
You definitely are.
But we're also searching for what heritage means to us, right? And it isn't maintaining the 1970s office block as some people want to do, or the neo-brutalist architecture, which I went to university at Macquarie in my first degree, and that was the great argument that Macquarie was this brutalist architecture, and all I saw was a bunch of concrete buildings that weren't finished properly.
Well, I think I'm old enough to know that when the cities were just central business districts and no one lived in them. I grew up in Melbourne in the sort of 70s and 80s when a trip to the city was a trip to no man's land, whereas fundamentally nothing to do in it. No one lived there. There was hardly anything in it apart from work. It's interesting, the comparisons to say Asia and the Western world. I think they are, of course, culturally very different, but there is a huge swathe of Gen Z behavior, regardless of where you are in the world, that is searching for more nostalgic gravity, which is sort of stepping away from tech. And we're calling it sort of tech-enabled humanity, where they're not turning it off because they've grown up with it, but they're trying to balance it, and they're looking for things like hobbies. There's a reason why clay making and throwing clay and social sports and the idea of that community activity is so is a huge groundswell right now with that audience.
Run clubs have become a huge thing here. Right?
It's also where they're finding each other. They're finding each other. They're dating, and so nightclubs are were the place we all went to. But
I did read a ridiculous article about a South Asian run club, because South Asians need to meet other South Asians so they can manage. So there's a South Asian run club.
they're probably
Which
probably
I'm like,
healthier.
really? Are we going to that level?
But it's an interesting quandary. This idea of what, I mean, the one thing we talked about at the dinner was this idea of what makes a good life, because I think that one of the great challenges that we see as consultants, we look at the human dimensions of everything. And I know in Australia, home ownership seems to be the great political button, right? When you look at anyone, whether it's even Pauline Hanson on One Nation, or whether it's the Liberal Party or even Labor, the concept of affordability to home ownership is a huge button. But the reality is, we probably need to stop pushing that ideal down on our young folk, because that ideal in Europe and that ideal even in Asia, where there's multi-generational housing or home ownership, isn't the ideal that sets up your identity, right? You can invest, you can rent. In Europe, you can rent your whole life and stabilize. And in New York City, you can be in a stabilized. I know people that have been in stabilized rental here for 30 years and are very happy in New York City in a stabilized rent apartment.
So what we call build to rent is a relatively new phenomenon in Australia, right? So we have about... I think we have, don't quote me, but it's something like 3,000 operational build-to-rent units, right?
Yeah.
And we're following the UK, which sort of 10 years ago or so had the private rental scheme, PRS is what they called it.
Yeah.
And they went down the path. But of course, this has been going on in the United States and Europe for a very, very long time. I mean, the whole Friends concept, if you remember back to the great days of Friends, they all lived in rented apartments. They had a super, I'm going to call it super. And no one outside of America knew who the super was.
Knew what that was. And their laundry was down the basement, and that's just the way New Yorkers have lived for a long time.
For eons. I know that the point there is an important one around. I think the idea of home ownership in the West, it's the same in the UK. It's the same in Canada. There is a belief that if you own your home, that is a investment in security. In Australia, and certainly in Australia, it is a wealth creation tool. If you invest in your home, you are more likely to be successful in terms of generating your own wealth. You're able to borrow against your house to do other things. You can do so. It's a stock of wealth. And I think one of the arguments here is, it's interesting the way you frame this around housing, as we need to broaden our thinking. You can invest, you can do other things. I think one of the arguments would be in Western societies where we have very, very large welfare systems now, and more need to spend money on things. Government searches for anything it can to raise funds. And the only area in Australia that's protected is the family home. Everything else is under attack from tax, right? So as a consequence of that, people drive into home ownership, because where else do you go without being attacked by tax? And you've got to remember, people often say that the tax system in the United States is quite expensive. They'll say, well, they've got a 50% marginal tax rate. Well, yeah, we've got a 47 plus marginal tax rate. The difference is the American system cuts in at $600,000 USD. The Australian system cuts in at 180,000 USD.
Right.
AUD. Fundamental difference, and that is what in economies drives investment. Like, how do I sort of maximize my wealth
Well,
opportunities? What's the rational
well,
way
here in
of
the
doing
States,
it?
well, here in the States, obviously the states have very different tax systems too. So,
Mm,
it's a little
that's
bit more
right.
complicated, maybe even in here. But
California versus
also,
Florida, right? Yeah.
exactly, and also we're paying, capital gain on our primary home. So this whole concept that the home is the nest egg isn't necessarily the right thing. There are people here who bought their houses in 1970 that for $200,000 that are now worth 3 million, and everything over
Got to
$500,000
be
you're going to
taxed.
pay capital gain on.
Yeah.
So they sit in those homes and they don't sell them. So you have two people sitting in
Yeah.
a six-person home because they can't afford to sell it, and they're not quite ready for retirement. So and I think I saw this in Australia too. People sit on their homes in Australia too because the cost of
100%.
going out of the home into a downsize is no longer the financial benefit it used to be, and so they're sitting in place. Now that stock isn't going back in. There should be tax incentives for
Mm,
people who are 60
yeah.
plus to move out of those homes and go and get apartments. There should be incentives to do that, to help with that generational turn. But going back to your point around it being, yes, it was a good investment when salaries and wages against, say, I guess, a deposit, and then of course a
Yeah,
mortgage made
100%.
made sense. That of course that was fine. But now the cost of entry for a home for a young person, they can't afford to even get the deposit together given the price of homes and income.
I think
And
we're
so the
running 10
increment,
times, 10 times
yeah,
salary, 10 times average,
yeah,
I think, in
yeah. And it's
Australia.
the same here. And it's pretty
Yeah.
much the same here, maybe a bit more in New York City. But what's happened is young people have turned their head to the stock market because it's incremental. It's
Mm,
incremental, and you can put in what you can afford when you can afford it, and you can accumulate wealth in the S&P and in other incremental investments over 30 years, probably at a higher rate of return, frankly, per year. And finally, young people are seeing that as a definite benefit, and that renting is fine. Let's incrementally, as we can afford it, put our money in the stock. Now, what does that mean for real estate? Well, it means that all the real estate's being bought up by and all the multifamily being bought up by institutions.
by
They're
institutions,
going
exactly.
around
Yeah.
and buying all the stock. They're going to be able to put the rents where they want them. The government haven't got any regulation for that yet. And so this is all coming down the pike a lot faster than I think any of us were prepared to really talk about, which is we're heading towards a confluence of calamity if we don't get the policy set right, if we don't look after young people, if we don't improve affordability, if we don't improve financial innovation. Here's the other challenge is that projects, there's capital. There's
Oh,
definitely
yeah.
capital in
Yeah, yeah.
America. In America, it's flowing relatively smoothly.
We can't
And there's
get
a lot
much
of
American
confidence.
interest in Australia, for example, because they've got too many good deals
No,
in America.
too many good deals here,
Right.
and there's plenty of
Yeah.
investment. We still obviously US still invests in the Middle East and other parts of Russia and other parts of
Yes,
Europe. There's
absolutely.
plenty of people investing in
We
Europe.
find, we have a US-based senior advisor at our day, our firm,
Yeah,
and he's an Aussie guy who I'll make sure you meet. Actually, you'll enjoy his
oh, that'd be
company.
great. Mm.
He's quite the larrikin, but he
Oh, good.
will he sort of says, I go, I play polo and I go sailing with all these fun guys, and they know where Paris is and they
Yes.
know where London is. But
Yeah.
when you talk about Australia, they start thinking about kangaroos and and sort of like really,
Yeah,
come on,
he's not wrong about that.
we're a
I
long way
mean,
away from anywhere, and they just don't think. And it makes sense. I mean, it takes almost a day to get from Sydney
there
to
are
New
so, there are
York.
so many great things about America, and I know that you're getting a lot of propaganda right now because of our administration and certainly because of what's happening in the world. And I know even having family back home ask me every day, how is it living in the States? Well, I can tell you, it's as good as it was 10 years ago. It's more
Exactly.
expensive.
Yeah.
But the rate of innovation in this country to actually change the world and push it forward is absolutely phenomenal. There is an absolute culture here to change the world, make it better, improve it. Are we falling behind on social infrastructure and housing? Yes. Do we have affordability problems? We absolutely do. Are we challenged by maybe some political unrest in this country? For sure, we are. But on the whole, Americans are positive innovators, and they're very, very good at what they do. I mean, there's a reason people migrate here because a lot of
Oh,
the energy
100%.
and
Yeah.
innovation happens in this country, I mean, if you look at what this country has done for the world in terms of technology, most of it's come from here. Most of it. And
Yeah,
and
I
a
agree.
lot of great innovations coming out of Europe too. And so we are obviously connected to Europe for that reason. But I think that to say that we're never attached to an administration, we're attached to a constitution. The constitution is an incredible document. I became an American citizen recently, and I did that because the constitution said something to me about freedom and prosperity and rule of law. All those things are very meaningful. And most people in Australia, when I talk to them, only get the propaganda about our administration and the president, which that you can have an opinion about that. Of course, everyone's entitled to opinion about his behaviour and about the administration, but you can't look at hundreds of years of incredible innovation and prosperity of a country and single its reputation down to 2 years. It is going to move forward. It is going to change again. And all of that will move forward, I think, in a really interesting way. I think our greatest challenge as in real estate, and certainly in property and real estate, is that we've got to really start thinking about adaptive reuse and what we're doing with empty buildings and not just keep creating, because I think there is a new conscious consumer coming through that is looking for adaptive reuse and the reuse of things rather than making everything new. It doesn't mean we won't make new buildings in new places. Then we've got a second city phenomena happening here where a lot of the great second cities outside of the big ones like Chicago, New York, LA are really starting to find their feet, in San Francisco, starting to find their feet. Great second cities that are re-emerging. And that's happening because, of course, people are migrating out of the tax-heavy states.
Yeah,
and they're going
So what's an
so
example of a
working.
second city in the United States context?
We
Is
are
that
working at the
Miami?
moment.
Would Miami be one?
Yes, and
Austin
Fort
would be
Lauderdale.
another.
Fort Lauderdale was
Lauderdale,
north of that. We're working in Atlanta and on the outer belt of Atlanta, where you've got dead stock, dead malls, and sort of things that are in wealthy locations.
Because Atlanta's quite well. Parts of Atlanta are quite wealthy.
Very wealthy, very wealthy, very well. Actually, it's a very diverse city, and actually a very exciting city. I'm surprised more people don't go there and get excited about it. I think there's some amazing innovation happening in Atlanta. But what I'm seeing, which is really exciting, is that there is a push, and it's got to do with what AI and maybe COVID, what AI has done for the world means you don't have to work in the city 5 days a week. There is flexibility now where you can work 3 days in the city and you can work from home. And I'm seeing that across every city in the world, but fundamentally in America, organizations that demanded return to work full time have released that again. And they're doing that because they want to retain talent. That talent has choices about where they work, where they invest their money, where they put their time. And no longer is the corporation the sanctity of work. You're seeing a huge, what I'm seeing, or I'm calling sort of entrepreneurial corporation, which is you can be a 4-person business with agentic staff making billions of dollars. You don't need a big office for that, and you can work remotely and work anywhere. That trend in young people means that we've got these giant commercial buildings that are being hollowed out and turned into apartments because we can't fill whole floors.
So how are you finding, I mean, there's a couple of great points there, which I just want to drill down on. First, being a small advisory firm, we are using AI a lot now in our firm. And my first instinct is to say, Ethan Mollick wrote a book, I think you recommended it, right? Which I read. And he talks about using AI as an intern, like bringing it. I think he talks about inviting it into everything, right?
Yes.
Which when the book was written in 2023, the basic 24 or 3, the basic AI was kind of okay, right? Now you kind of use it now, and it's like this. It really is an intern, which begs the question: what happens to? So one of the points I've been making on this when talking to people is, I like using it, but I know what the answer is because I've been a victim of life for a long time. And so it works for me. What if I didn't know the answer? How will I use?
This is the great debate, and we have this in our global business too, which is the book's is Co-Intelligence, and
That's right, Co-Intelligence.
It's a great book, and it was given to me by an architect actually in Woodsbagot, Matt Deschamps, who and I read it cover to cover. He gave me a few books to read actually, which have been very inspiring to me. Why I like this book is because even back when it was written, it was talking about its potential future, where it was going, but it was still talking about it as a knowledge imperative. You had to invite it in, you had to prompt it, but you, the human, were directing it. And this is pre AGI, right? This is before general intelligence. This is when you're using it as a prompting tool. As it became, because artificial intelligence has been in government behind the doors for 40 years. It's now just open. It's open source. So now it's come through to open source and in the hands of everybody. He wrote that book before AGI. We're seeing the starting of AGI happening now with superintelligence in 3 or 4 years. And now as it moves into robotics, humanoid behavior, things like that, it's another new frontier around what happens to the future of industry. We're talking about places for people. What if we're not designing for people anymore? What if human-centered design isn't the only thing we have to think about? Because robots don't need air, they don't need views, they don't need windows, they don't need any of that stuff. They don't need beds. So what happens when we can produce the same amount of industry, the same amount of GDP output with 1/10 of the people? What happens to all those people, and what happens to the world? I think what Ethan Mollick's book does is talks about it being a tool, and now we're talking about it making decisions and being sentient. And actually, it's not a tool. It's teaching us. He also talks about the fact you have to let it in, and you have to let it teach you. If you're telling it what to do the whole time, and not learning from it, then I think you miss the point. Because I think you're then using it like a tool rather than what can I learn from it? How can I be better here? And maybe I don't need to be doing half the things I'm doing. I should let it do it, because it will do it better, more efficiently, and make better decisions than I would. And this is happening through every industry, not just architecture. This is every industry.
He uses the example of the calculator, right?
That's right.
You know, I mean, even when I was going to school, actually, there was a view that we shouldn't be reliant on a calculator in early education when you were learning maths, right? That's not the case now. They're quite happy for you to use a calculator, right? My children are on laptops immediately, right? Even the 7-year-old, right? So things have, and that's why I like this concept of, you know, of challenging a human to say, well, you're actually a cyborg, which I think is also out of this book.
Yeah. Yes.
And why are you a cyborg? Well, you rely on everything for technology, and you rely on technology for everything. And I realized this the other day. I was on a flight to Tokyo, and the flight didn't have Wi-Fi. I was beside myself. I didn't know what to do. Right? Like, thought, and we were flying in the day, which is really unusual. And so I watched a movie.
What did you do?
I watched a movie. It was wonderful.
You could have written something, Jason. You could have actually written down your thoughts. You could have written a thesis in that time.
But I thought, you know, I'm not turning my computer on. I'm going to watch some meaningless. Actually, it wasn't meaningless. It was very good.
I don't know why it is that we all think that AI is a tool. I've stopped considering it a tool. I'm now looking at it as a partner. I see it as a partner. I don't think about it as just a calculator, which a lot of people do. Because that requires input.
Or advanced web search, which is what a lot of people do.
Yes, or that requires me to know math, right? So now I can Claude code, and I can actually vibe code, and I don't need to know coding, but I can actually create my own everything, right? So if you see it as a partner, you're seeing it differently. The big question in architecture and design and placemaking, and certainly development, is could it ever do the ideas? This is a great debate in our industry, and I'm hosting a debate at World City in Singapore about the future of cities. Robotics, will it make the cities bloom as places of life and innovation, or will it make them redundant? What happens when 50% of our workforce becomes robotic? I'm not just talking about humanoids, but everything. Car parking is robotic. Cars are robotic. Everything's robotic. You don't need car parking structures. What happens to cities when this all changes? And I don't think we have the answers. What we have is thesis around, we know what's coming. We know where it's heading, but we're not prepared to, no one is prepared to put a line in the sand and say, this is the likely outcome. No one.
Yeah.
And so we're having
Yeah.
a debate in World City with some really interesting people around this very topic. And the interest we've had in the debate's been really interesting because no one in tech is considering the impact of their technologies on places or on real estate. They're thinking about it as business tools. It's going to create more wealth. It's going to create more technologies, more products, more things. Yes, but we all have to live somewhere.
Yeah.
we all
Yeah.
we all have to be somewhere. And if we're not being able to afford the places we're making, then all of that wealth is only for the 1%. What happens to everybody else?
So let's
And
dive into that question a little bit, because I think that's a fascinating question. I agree with you. Everyone's viewing the AI revolution as a business tool. Like I know in our business, it's okay. We can use this to go faster, do things faster. We're not building spreadsheets from scratch anymore. It does the first draft
yeah,
for us, and
it's
then
amazing.
we take it from there. It does mean we need less people, right?
Yep,
Then
of course.
that will go through the economy. So a consequence of that is people will find other jobs to do, right? And that's always been the great theory. Uh, but just focusing on place for a second, and back to our commercial office situation. So I would say, at least in Australia, the subletting phenomenon has pretty much exhausted itself. We haven't had a new office
Yes.
building in Sydney, for example, for a long period of time. There's only one that I can think of that's sort of under construction, and that
We're
was,
making
a while
we're
ago.
making a few. We're making a few 55 Pit and a few
55
others
Pit is the one
that
I was
we're
thinking
making.
of. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is Mirvac with Mitsui, right?
Yeah, very
Mitsui
good.
Fujisan, right? Which is a great building, but that's
A really
really
great
the
build.
only main building that's
Yeah.
going on right now for obvious
Yeah.
reasons. Office itself in Australia is trading okay because the REITs are still trading stuff out, but no one's
Yep.
building anything new.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier in the US, there is a move now to convert sort of B, C grade stock into apartment buildings.
Yes.
The great argument with that has been that it's actually really hard to do that for
It
roof
is.
heights and blah,
Policy
blah,
and
right?
policy and policy
And
and planning.
policy, and I noticed, I think it was Mayor Adams that came out before he was obliterated in his election. I don't think he even got to stand from memory. That tried to change some rules around this. What is actually happening in office in the US? So you
The office
mentioned
market
a bunch
here,
of things about work from home. I get that part, and that there's changing. But what is actually happening more
the
broadly?
office market here, the office market in New York City, in the Class A category, they're commanding some of the biggest rents they've ever made. The
Yeah.
actual office market's buoyant at the Class A level. As you mentioned before, second tier, Class B, C buildings really struggling to keep momentum and to keep tenants. Whereas the Class A is commanding huge rents. And by the way, there's a handful of the biggest companies in the world who always want to be in New York City. So
Yeah,
all the big
100%.
companies that want to be here, so they're always going to be here and fill up the Class
No
A
one's going to
office.
give up a Manhattan address, right?
God, no.
My old
No,
firm, Lend-Lease, we used to have an office at the Met Center,
oh yeah,
which
I
was
know
beautiful.
Lend-Lease, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, everything about the Class A office in New York is buoyant and lots of great assets. Of course, Chase Manhattan has built their new tower here, and it's an amazing building, right? But if Jamie Dimon said very, very publicly, a lot of their staff can't afford to live in New York City. So they're moving to other parts of the world, whether it be Austin or second tier cities to sort of Texas, because the tax benefits of those states are better for individuals. And so hanging on to staff in New York, when you've got agentic models, you've got AI that can replace them, and you have these really expensive rents, it's got down to specificity. I mean, the reality is the market's strong. People are just being cautious in moving forward. 10 years ago, it was a lot more buoyant. You'd say bullish in the way it was moving. Now people are spending money, but it's done with caution and it's done for the right reason, right? It's not done because the money's not here or because there's no demand, plenty of demand. It's just the future is grayer and a lot more out of focus than it's ever been. And it's got to do with things like culture. When you think about kids graduating, they don't know whether to go to school and do coding. They don't know what to study. A lot of people are graduating from school. A lot of people aren't going to college because of the cost. And so there is a giant change in the education market, and there's a giant change in graduates that are coming out of school, not knowing really where to find themselves and can they afford to be in these big cities. I saw last week, California, highest GDP growth in the world in terms of a
Really?
state. It
Really?
outstrips every
So,
other part of the world,
so
including
that's
America.
another narrative we get here, that California is failing and taxes are killing California. And,
California pays the most taxes of any state to the federal government. In fact, I think it makes up 44% or some crazy number of the whole of federal government's taxes. And that's because the largest tech companies in the world are there paying
located
reasonably
there.
large taxes, right? So you've
Yeah.
got the Mag 7
So it's a
sitting in
Mag 7
California.
story. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's great for California. But we've got to find other things to do here in New York City.
Yeah.
So that and what I've also seen is that pre-COVID and certainly pre-AI, people didn't have choices about where they worked. It was a very strict policy on you'd be in Monday to Friday, you would clock in, you would clock out. The expectation was you would be there. That expectation evaporated during COVID and certainly hasn't fully recovered.
No,
There
I
is
agree
now,
totally.
and I think that's got to do also with the fact that given a choice, a lot of people would choose the ocean from the city, or given a choice,
Yeah.
they would choose the bush, the country, from the city. And now they finally have that choice given to them, and they want both. They want to balance both of that. And a lot of corporations are trying to help staff, and we do with our team, who are working out of or living out of the city for affordability reasons. We give them that flexibility so they can come back and forward from New York to home. This is not an uncommon problem across the whole of New York City. But look, let's not forget, America is not New York City, and New York City is not America half the time, right? It's a very different culture here.
I mean, America is so many different places, right?
It really
I often
is.
say
And
this
that
about
diversity.
India is not one country.
Oh.
India is multiple places, right?
And it's actually what draws people to it. So I'm hoping that diversity is held on to as we go through, the political challenges we're heading in that we're in right now. But I still think
I do feel so. And sorry, this is a problem with teams as well. We sort of sometimes talk over each other. But
sorry,
I do feel though that there is a tendency in the media to think that everything is driven by politics, because it is true in many cases that government is more interventionist than ever before. In fact, we formed a business on that basis. My colleagues and I, in my day job, we've worked on the government side of transactions. We've worked on the private side of transactions. So we see the interface. It is true that government is more interventionist than ever before. It's not just regulation or legislation anymore. It's investment. They're putting debt into projects. They're putting sometimes equity into projects. They are dictating who can buy what. There's all these sort of things, and that's basically why we exist, right? Is sort of bridging that understanding to what the public sector wants and what politicians are trying to do in terms of sovereign capability and whatever they want for their country, and what the private sector can do in terms of bringing capital and innovation and expertise. That's basically where we live. But I do think there's a view somehow that politics and government drives everything, and I can take an Australian case, which is COVID for us was the beginning of the government sort of realizing it had more authority and power over people than it knew it had. Nobody knew who a state premier was, or a governor in a US context. Nobody tracked every day what the premier said or did, or in the state was responsible for infrastructure, hospitals, schools. It just got on with things. COVID comes along and you've got a premier doing a daily press conference. You've got a premier deciding that it can close the state's borders. The Queensland premier at the time closed Queensland state borders and refused to let people from New South Wales use Queensland hospitals. Like, this was a whole new concept. And that has now brought into the fray this concept that government basically will be there to solve all problems all the time. I don't get the sense, and you tell me, certainly in the UK that is the case as well. I don't get the sense that's an American phenomenon.
Oh gosh. I mean, the concept of overreach globally I think COVID has a lot to answer for, because I think government had a duty of care to its citizens that it probably had to step in and look after. And that debate is a whole other hour for us, Jason, talking about was
Right.
there overreach? Did the government do the right
Yes.
thing?
No, and I don't think we should go there, but I think the
I will
product
tell
of
you,
that has been
the
more involved.
byproduct of it, is that maybe governments got very buoyant about the fact that they did have more control maybe than they thought they had during that process.
Certainly in an Australian context, that's the case.
And that didn't dissipate post COVID. It is settling down here. Obviously, we have a very different style of leadership at the moment federally, that maybe no one was quite prepared for. Certainly 40% of the country voted for that style of leadership, right? And it had a lot to do with, I think, the way it's spoken about is a lot of young men, a lot of disenfranchised young people also voted for him, for the very reason that we didn't come out of the back of COVID in very good shape. In fact, culturally, we were a little barren of vision and where we were heading, right? So I understand the mechanics. But looking at it objectively, you would say that we've now finally let that settle down. And there is another new global phenomena called AI stepping in that has the same level of excitement and the same level of uncertainty as maybe COVID, and I think governments have a duty of care here as well, which I don't think they're quite prepared for. I think we don't have, certainly here in the States, I'm not sure what it's like in Australia actually, but I don't think we have put together a very good governance board on the very outcomes of this. We've led it to private and public money to start driving and dictating how this is all working, and we're all using it. Look at our company. I mean, we are absolutely 100% using all of it. But where are the risks? Where has it come from? What's next? So we all have a bit of a duty of care of helping that happen. But I'd argue that governments need to step in a little bit, not overreach, but start laying some very good policies so everyone's looked after. Everyone.
Well, so it's interesting you say this, because I think we, in an Australian context, are not having the conversations really. If you look at the top line conversations in Australia right now around fuel prices, right? Cost of living, fuel prices, cost of housing, it's still very basic stuff, right? Basic living stuff, I would put it in that. The response to the oil price spike has been a cut in fuel taxes in Australia, right? That's the debate. The AI debate, I don't sense it's really something that's penetrated government thinking yet. We had an announcement today, for example, that they're going to invest in more drone technology, but that's a response to defense requirements. It's not a response to AI use. So I think this is we tend to follow America a few years after America does what it does, right? We tend to, it tends to permeate into our lexicon. So I think the AI discussion from a governmental perspective and a corporate perspective, has some way to run. And I think corporates are grappling with it. I have seen some reports of some of the financial services sector now realizing that AI is going to replace a large swathe of people who do
huge
agentic jobs, if I can put it that way.
Yep.
That's a wave that's coming.
It's huge.
They're going to put it forward, and the unions are going to hate it. And
it's going to affect the mainly white collar at the beginning, but blue collar is coming too. Robotics and industry is coming, but they're predicting 50% of white collar work will become agentic workforces. And you go, what happens to everybody else at that point? There will be great innovation. With every major change in the world, there's going to be great innovation. So I'm excited about what people will do. People aren't going to lay down. They're going to go and find something to do. They'll innovate in really interesting ways. And there's some great innovation coming. The difference between this and the dot-com change of 2000, right, or 1999 to dot-com and e-commerce, is that e-commerce and dot-com was there to actually let us really in to utilize the world's resources, to actually get much better resourced, to actually innovate as humans. This is being set up, which it will replace humans, right? It's a replacement mechanism for a lot of people's jobs and a lot of tasks that no one wants to do. Of course, you're going to put robots down mines. Of course you are. Why would you put a human in that terribly dangerous position when a robot could do it. Well, think about every single mining job that goes away. I mean, this is there's
Well,
huge medical
Australia is well, we make our
is
bread
mining
off
rich.
mining, right?
Mining rich, and so that's going to, of course, change. Think about the medical industry. Of course, you're going to want your heart surgery done by something that's 99.9999% accurate and isn't fallible to any human mistake. Of course you are down the track. That's exactly what you're going to want as a human. So we're at the precipice of all this change. All of it, for me, is very positive if we're able to have the conversation about what it means for humans and what it means for where we live. So I come from a world which is sort of focused on placemaking, which is at its core about making sure that we're advancing humanity in the right way. That is core to who we are. Advancing humanity so that every decision that we make is there to make people's lives better. And if everyone can agree to that central vision, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's AI, real estate, beachside property, luxury, down to affordable housing, if everyone's talking about advancing humanity, then there's innovation that will happen to make people's lives better. But often that's not the case. It's not the
Yes, I
central,
agree.
it's not the central idea. It's how do I make money? People using real estate like the stock market. Build it bigger and we'll sell it later. Who cares who's in it? Because it's New York City, it's going to sell. Who
It'll
cares
sell
what the
anyway.
cost
Yeah.
is? Right. And those sorts of behaviors
So
are
let's
good
let's
for
drill down into
cash.
that a little bit on place because your focus is place, and we've talked a lot about AI in this conversation already, replacing everything because I guess that's the zeitgeist right now. We're all
Yeah.
kind of grappling with what AI is going to do, and even me, who's not the strongest on technology, is loving AI, right? So that's got to tell you something. What is your sense on where places are going? So we've talked a little bit about cities converting into people living in them.
Yep.
And the bit I'm struggling with is if they've got nothing to do, that's an interesting question of what a
Yep.
city looks like, because we've seen what,
Yeah.
vast unemployment looks like. It's not
Yep.
a pretty sight.
Not pretty.
And so that's a first question. And the second is if we're moving more to a distributed working environment where people are working anywhere, and that was the big narrative of COVID, wasn't it? Well, if you want to work from home, I can hire you in Singapore, I can hire you in Malaysia, I can hire you in India. I don't need to hire you in Australia. So
That's right.
up to you guys. And you know what? Firms did that, and it went down that track. So
We
from
did
a
that.
place perspective, then, from our great cities, the Sydneys, the New Yorks, the Londons, what is the future?
It's really a confluence of things, but all the conversations we're having with our clients around the globe is that we have to focus on culturally how people are navigating it, right? So what does that mean? What it means is when I went to Copenhagen, there was a small experiment called the Urban Rigger, which is a small co-living space. I think BRK put together on the water just in Copenhagen. This experiment to say, is there a world where you could co-commune with people you don't know and you could share resources, right? Where you're sharing a kitchen, you're sharing a living room, and all you're doing is going back to your bed and your shower. That concept 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago, was something that no one was considering. Why would anyone want to do that? But now as we step forward and we see that affordability isn't a quick fix, this is 20, 30 years away from being managed, right? Because there's no way we can, unless everything blows up and stops, there's no way we can change the course of where this is all heading. It's getting harder, not easier. We have to double down on building innovation. We have to make sure that we're actually building things smarter and more affordable, cheaper, so we can pass those savings on to people when they're living, how they live. If we're not doing that, and you mentioned in your sort of discussion guide to me, what's the impact of tariffs? Well, tariffs is driving up every building cost, certainly in America. So things are more expensive to build. The developer, God bless them, they're the ones whose margins are absolutely eroding in the middle of it because the capital markets want their return. They won't lend their money unless they get a certain percentage return.
Correct. Yeah.
If governments can't curb inflation, and so affordability is out of control, people can't afford to live, and that's something they can't lower at the moment. That's going to take 5 years to at least cool off. So in the middle, the developer with the vision who are making everything for people to live are wedged between those two big problems. You've got finance who's not prepared to lend the money at a different rate. They want to keep their rates because they've usually got public trade behind them, and shareholders. And then you've got people who can't afford to live. That gap is widening. So my advice to everyone that wants to listen is that we need to focus on financial innovation. How do we rethink a pro forma? We have to just completely rethink the way we're financing things. That might be changing the 30-year mortgage to a 50-year mortgage. That might be multi-generational loan. That might be the idea that we have to co-commune and co-live. It might be changing the Western ideal that the kids move out of home when they're 18 and go buy something new, to doing what Asian countries do, which is multi-generational living, and that helps with growing wealth over time. But in the Western world, we don't have that. We also don't know how to age in place or have really good retirement. We're not good with retirees and with the aging population. We discount them and put them in homes. It's not the way it happens in Asia. Asia is very multi-generational. They look after their elderly. They're respected. There's a very different culture there that helps that problem. So I think in the Western world, we can only fix the concept of placemaking if we change culture and we change the way we live. And that's not happening. Our ideals are the same as they were in 1950. Leave home, couple up, buy a home, get married, get a corporate job. That ideal, which is so out of date, hasn't changed. That being said, what's changing, of course, is the content world, right? That's changing. Who would have thought there'd be a $10 million a year content creator as a job, 15 years ago?
Totally.
Right. So that's changing, but it's only the 1%. You've got a lot of young people looking in that window at their phone going, why aren't I making 10 million a year as a content creator?
Or right? why am I not making 35x in 2 weeks on the stock market, which is the other one, right?
That's right. So they're looking at their phone, they're looking at the 1% making money. They're judging themselves against that 1%. What does that do? That causes terrible instability. That causes obviously mental illnesses on the rise. We've got a lot of young depressed people. It's because we don't know how to control and manage that situation. And I don't think that we're at a stage culturally where we've really understood how to deal with the mass of our 7 billion people on the planet. We're looking at the 1% online and we're idolizing that 1% and we're not thinking about how people are actually living. I look, one of the great challenges I have 2 young children, 27
How old are your kids?
Not that 27 and 23.
Actually.
Oh. And they're 2 boys. They're young.
Yeah.
2 boys out in the world making their way. And what's really interesting about watching them,
they're going through this right now, I guess, right?
They are.
Mine are 12, 10, and 7. So we're just trying to learn what this all means.
They're about to, I had challenges with one of my youngest, just getting through school and the education system and just not knowing what to do and where it's all heading. And a lot of kids suffer this when they exit. They've got so many choices.
Yeah.
They don't know what to do.
What do I do? Yeah.
But how that impacts places, because we often do this when we're talking about making places, we are 10, 15, 20 years out, because we're not looking at what it takes to build it and make it in 5 years. We're looking at what happens when you as developers sell it, leave. We only think, and this is short-termism at its worst, we only think in terms of our own mortality when we're making things. It's a human condition.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
We don't go, you know what? We're all making this, but in 50 years, which is nothing, none of us will be here. So what are we making? And so we have to get better at long range thinking. We've got to get better, which is why we have these off the record dinners and why we're researching Good Life and why we're researching the sort of future of behavior, because that's really what matters. We're making places today. People making a commercial tower that will be built in 5 years have to think about what those workforces will look like in 5 to 10 years from now. not what happens today. What is the next rental opportunity or the next tenant opportunity in 2 years' time when a lease is up? If you're building and you're making, your long range thought is everything. That will underpin the risk slightly, but also get you to understand what you should be designing for. And I don't think we do enough of this. I think we're making with pro formas that are 10 years old, rather than what is the financial innovation of the future? What is the culture of the future? What are the new jobs that are emerging? What should we be designing for? And mixed use, what are people living in? We have to really
the
start.
mixed use point is so important. I mean, I think you would have seen it when you came to Sydney recently, that our city has a dearth of people living in it.
It does.
And that's because...
Actually quite exciting.
Well, that's right. But the reason why of that, there was always this view we had to protect the employment district, the employment zone, which perhaps in a pre-COVID environment sort of made sense. I never agreed with it because I come from a city where you live everywhere, right? Like there's nowhere in Hong Kong that isn't always active.
Of course.
Right? And so now you look at the city of Sydney now as, I think, starting to embrace this idea that you can actually live in the city, but it's only the very wealthy that are getting to live in the city, you know, and so that's not going to work. So this whole idea of conversion of office buildings to apartments, you know, one of our clients is thinking about, well, you know, how do you deal with these height issues in roofs? How do you deal with, you know, inappropriate staircases? How do you deal with how do you deal with your ventilation that is not set up for an apartment building? Perhaps AI will tell them.
I think we also made the mistake with affordability of trying to work on the price point of apartments, and the way you do that is you don't change the cost of making it. What you do is you make them really micro and small, and we got them down to so small that we were selling car parks with a bed in it and calling it a 1-bedroom apartment or a student accommodation apartment, and making lots of these that you can no longer finance, that no bank wants to finance, that ultimately will become ghettos over time because you can't sell them.
Exactly.
And also, what kind of experience is that for people? Like, it's fine that you got the price point right so they could live there, but now we're looking at all these micro apartments saying, well, what kind of experience is that for somebody? Is that what they want to live in long term? No. So we've made them all, but really that's why I think co-living is interesting, where you get a bigger kitchen, a bigger living space. You have to co-commune with people, but you're getting more space, more usable space, and a better lifestyle for yourself. We've got to start thinking like this.
But even luxury, even ultra luxury, is adopting these co-living concepts, right? So, you know, we're working on a project where the building is like a hotel. And you can rent the dining facility equipped with chef and all this stuff. And instead of anyone entering your apartment, you can have drinks in your apartment overlooking the harbour, and go down to you know, Chef Sven, who's flown in from Sweden, and he's going to produce this beautiful meal for you. And somebody comes and cleans it all up, and you know, you don't have to work. That's actually equivalent to a hotel. And of course, in the 1950s and 60s, some wealthy people used to live in hotels.
Of course.
That's how they did it. They just moved from hotel to hotel. So I don't see why some of those principles couldn't, and in fact they are, coming into more mid-market product, and you know, towards that co-living concept. We're working on another one where it's potential hospital accommodation, where in the olden days, nurses, as part of their salary package, had accommodation. There's no reason why a young nurse could live next to a hospital in a co-living sort of format with other nurses, and part of their salary package.
It's a great idea.
But again, not a new idea. This is 1950s, 1960s thinking. We then decided not to do that and merge everything into a salaried payment. And
we got very clever, didn't we? We got very clever with ourselves, and here we are, where people are actually struggling just with the day-to-day. I've never seen more people that I know living paycheck to paycheck.
It's getting worse, right? And the concept of the buy now, pay later poor is something that we haven't addressed now, but that's getting worse and worse as well. And people are just, you know, because what they're doing is they're buying their beautiful couch, the latest television, the latest car, whatever it is,
and renting it,
and they're not paying for it for 5 years, and all of a sudden it all comes at once. bang,
Mm.
and next thing you know, you're stuck. And so these sort of financial literacy questions are in there as
Don't
well.
spend what you don't have is the basics, right?
Well,
Don't
that's
spend
right.
what you don't
That's
have.
right.
But
But
look,
again,
we've lived
in the West, we are victims of
consumerism.
a consumerist society where we think we need to have all this stuff because other people have all this stuff, and therefore, and we're all victims of it in some way or the other, but
But that's why the
some more
new
than others.
ideal, like when you
Mm.
resettle and reset the new ideal for what a good life is, we just got to realign people's expectations. There should be happiness. We are all more healthy. We are all more better off. People are generally happier, and we have sorry, not generally happier. People are much
People
better off and
are, yeah,
healthier,
yeah,
much better and
certainly,
healthier.
yeah.
The world is better, and yet there are such huge increases in depression and mental health still. We're getting something wrong, right?
Well, I do.
Everything's better. Yeah. But anyway, look, there's so much more we could talk about
We do. I was saying
about
we'll have
how
to end soon because it's and we could go on another 2 or 3 hours.
Mm,
It's been such a pleasure having you on, Steve.
really great. And we'll
We
stay in
I don't know
touch.
if we've solved all the world's problems, but we've certainly
There's more to
addressed
talk
some of
about,
them.
and I will send you my note for the World City Conference in Singapore.
No,
If
I'd
you can
love
get
to.
there,
And
that'd be
look, I
good.
hope you'll come on again sometime.
Yeah,
We'd love to have you back, and we'll
perfect.
we'll
Love to.
keep talking. But for the moment, Stephen Cornwell, thank you so much for being part of the Jason
Pleasure.
D'Souza Show.
Pleasure. See you soon.